Hello everyone, my name is Olivia and welcome to the most anticipated video of the year, my favorite books of 2024. I have an even 10 books to share with you and I thought it would be fun to go in chronological order because I can't necessarily rank them based on my most favorite to my least favorite because they're all new favorite books of mine. So let's get right into it. Let's start with my first favorite read of 2024. So in January, I decided to read Normal People by Sally Rooney, and this changed my world forever. This was my first ever Sally Rooney novel that I have ever picked up, and I always tell the story that a bookseller recommended this to me on my birthday, and she said that I would fall in love with this story, and she was absolutely correct. That was my first ever time getting a recommendation from a bookseller, and it was a really exciting moment because we had a wonderful hour-long conversation with each other, and she recommended one of my new favorite books of all time. If you don't know what Normal People is about, we follow Connell and Marianne. Connell is a very popular boy in high school, and Marianne's mother cleans his house, so that's how Marianne and Connell kind of meet together in Ireland, and they form a friendship and a secret relationship with one another that doesn't go beyond the doors of their house. So no one in high school knows that they know each other intimately, and they eventually move on into college and into adulthood, where they form this relationship with one another where they feel so incredibly lonely around anyone else, but they feel this connection and camaraderie with one another because they have this shared melancholy and their shared views of life, and we follow them as they journey from high school into adulthood. This is a really interesting novel exploring what it's like to be lost in your 20s. I think it really captures the messiness that comes along with entering adulthood for the first time. And Connell and Marianne are very interesting to me because they have this shared codependency with one another where they aren't necessarily the perfect fit for one another, but they continually seek each other out as the years pass, and no matter how much time separates them between meetings, they still fall back into this relationship that you might not necessarily agree with. And there's so many different ways that you can dissect Normal People. You can dissect it from the lens of adulthood, from the lens of a codependent relationship, from the lens of two very lonely people who kind of find this solace in one another because they feel like nobody else understands them but each other. And I fell in love with Normal People. I think the writing is absolutely beautiful. I highlighted this a ton. I have not seen the show yet. I'm really afraid to watch the show because I feel like it's going to crush me, but I'm also really excited to eventually see it, and I fell in love with Normal People. I think it's definitely worth the hype. Don't let the lack of quotation marks prevent you from picking up this novel. Once you fall into the flow of the narrative and Sally Rooney's writing style, you barely notice it, and it flows so wonderfully. It feels effortless. My next favorite read that I picked up in 2024 is 84 Charing Cross Road. So my friend Ariel recommended this to me, and we went to a bookstore together in New York City, and we picked out a book for each other to read, and I picked out The Letters of Vincent van Gogh to her, and she picked out 84 Charing Cross Road for me because we both love epistolary novels, which are novels that are primarily composed of letters. This is a collection of letters from the 1950s between Helen Hanff and a bookstore in the UK, and their relationship that they form with one another as they get to know one another, and Helen becomes a loyal customer of the bookstore. And Helen is a really fun, spunky lady. She has a flair for the dramatics. She's a really fun personality to read from. Her letters are full of humor and heart, and she just has a wonderful love for literature, and this kind of reignited my love for reading. I think that if you're in a book slump or if you're feeling uninspired, you should pick this up because the overwhelming love for literature between Helen and the booksellers in the UK is so beautiful. I cannot recommend this enough. I think it's a really short, quick read that will just inspire you and make you love literature all over again. It's such a sweet read. It's definitely something that you can read while you drink a cup of coffee because it's so quick to finish, and I had such a fun time with it. Now let's move on to a book that I cannot stop thinking about even after I finished it. I believe in February or March, and it is The Warm Hands of Ghost by Katherine Arden. The Warm Hands of Ghost is a historical fiction story set during World War I. We follow two siblings. One is a combat nurse who recently returned back to Canada, and then we follow Freddie, who is on the front lines of the war when he goes missing and is claimed to be dead, and they tell Laura that her brother has passed away, but there's something inside her that doesn't believe that that's true, so she decides to return back to Europe in hopes of finding her brother because she truly believes that something is amiss and she's going to get to the bottom of it. My weird way of pitching this book is that if you love the movie 1917 and you love the song Hotel California by the Eagles, you'll love this book because it's a perfect mixture of that. I've always wanted a book or a movie centered around Hotel California because the entire concept of the song is that someone checks into a hotel but they're not able to leave, and it's full of spirits and it's a really mysterious type of setting to be stuck in. And The Warm Hands of Ghosts combines a historical fiction element of World War I but also mixes it together with paranormal fiction. So there's something paranormal woven into the narrative that I don't want to give away, and Freddie is the primary character who is dealing with these paranormal elements, but it eventually bleeds into Laura's life as well. And the way that it is exploring the horrors of war and the way that these soldiers are put into the front lines without care for their mental health is really interesting. I think the conversations of the horrors of war is perfectly executed in this novel, and I really love Katherine Arden's writing. She is the author of The Bear and the Nightingale, which is a fantastic fantasy trilogy that I really enjoyed, and I think that she really lets her writing flourish in this novel. I want more people to read this. If you pick up any book from this list, add this one to your TBR. I think it's very underrated. I think it's definitely worth your time. It's something that I cannot stop thinking about and I feel like I'm going to return to in the future. I don't have a copy of this book, so I finished filming this video and was doing other things, and I was like, oh my god, I forgot to talk about this book, and it is Thirst. Thirst is an Argentinian historical fiction vampire novel between two women. One is a vampire and one is a human, so it's split into two different perspectives. We first follow the vampire when she is a human in the past and she gets turned into a vampire, and we follow her journey moving between being a human and a vampire and the loneliness that comes along with it, and then we eventually see her connect with the human woman in the present day Argentina, and they both have this shared melancholy and this shared isolation. It really explores how being a vampire is a lonely existence. You watch everyone in your family eventually pass away over the hundreds of years that you've lived, and in this particular case we follow this vampire as she is witnessing the changes over the course of history in Argentina. So we see it move into the industrial age and then the modern age, and she is witnessing her country change over time and how much anger she has within herself and how much loneliness she has. And this is a very polarizing book because it's very introspective. It is really in the heads of these two characters, and they don't necessarily interact a lot in the novel. This is primarily their own separate journeys and how they mirror one another, and I really enjoyed it because I love a novel that is really in the heads of a character. I love introspection. I love long internal monologues, and it's not dialogue heavy. It's full of these lush descriptions that would maybe bore other readers, but for me, I found it so immersive and so compelling, and it's just a really great vampire novel. So I guess I would recommend this if you are also a fan of Nosferatu, because it has that same dark tone to it, but it is a sapphic vampire novel set in Argentina, and I think that those aspects are so interesting. So sorry, I completely forgot to mention this. I didn't have it physically in front of me, and if something's not physically in front of me, I don't know it exists. Now let's move on to my favorite Sally Rooney book that I have picked up because I read all 4 of her books this year, and it is Beautiful World, Where Are You? I'm sure you're all tired of me talking about this book, but if you are new here, Beautiful World, Where Are You follows follows two best friends who are living farther apart from each other now that they're later into their adulthood, and they primarily correspond through emails. And Beautiful World, Where Are You is just a love letter to life, to friendship, to the human connection. And I love this book so much because it really captures the essence of one, getting older in your 20s and how your friendships kind of change over time and how you fall in and out of love, but also how you fall in and out of love with life itself and how you have to find your own version of happiness. And that version of happiness may not fit what you thought your future would be, and it might look a little bit different. I feel like the two main characters, Alex and Eileen, were just plucked from my soul and put onto the page. The way that they just kind of shared their musings with one another, whether it be about politics or the media or the way that we function in a society, and the way that they view certain situations felt so relatable and is a real testament to its time, because I believe that this was written during lockdown, and you can feel the love for the human connection during lockdown through this, because the best friends are primarily corresponding via email, and it's very similar to how we corresponded with one another during lockdown, where we would FaceTime and we would text people. It felt like a beautiful exploration of lockdown and friendship and adulthood and the complexities that come along with that. Cannot recommend this book enough. It's definitely one of my favorite books of all time. I cannot stop raving about it. I have two nonfictions on this list that I have to recommend. One is a memoir, one is a biography, and the memoir that I have to recommend is Miracle in the Andes by Nando Parado. Nando Parado is one of the survivors of the Andes plane crash, which is explored in Netflix's Society of the Snow, which I highly recommend that you watch. But Nando Parado is a very interesting survivor of the Andes plane crash that happened with a Uruguayan rugby team. They were on a plane when the plane crashed in the Andes Mountains, and they had to survive in some of the harshest conditions for 72 days. But Nando's a very interesting person who's a part of this entire situation, because he's one of the two rugby players who decided to ascend the Andes Mountains and walk an incredible distance to find the rescuers who eventually found the rest of the team and saved them from eventual death. The way that he describes this entire situation, so many horrible things happened, but he only ever looks at it from a place of love and appreciation. He sees everything as sort of divine intervention, and he sees every situation that occurred in these 72 days as something greater than himself. He doesn't look back at the situation with anger. He lost his mother and his sister in this plane crash, and normally one would feel anger or resentment that this situation happened, but Nando looks at it from a place of appreciation, because without this situation, he wouldn't be the man he is today, and he's a wonderful man who still is connected with the survivors of this plane crash. They still have a beautiful relationship with one another. At the end of the day, he said that they survived because of love. And I think that's so profound, because I think if I were to have gone through this situation and I lost two major people from my family, I wouldn't look at it from a place of love. But the fact that these people loved each other so much, they were so connected with one another because they were rugby players, so they worked like a team together in this situation to survive. And that love and that care for one another is one of the main reasons why they survived. And I think it's such a beautiful way to look at life, and it really changed my perspective of life. Not only did it make me want to be a more positive person, but reading about the situations that they went through, like the fact that they had to eat ice to get water, and the fact that they had to resort to cannibalism in order to survive, it makes you appreciate everything around you. I remember I saw Society of the Snow, and then I read Miracle in the Andes and I Had to Survive, which is another memoir from another survivor in the plane crash. And I was just filled with so much gratitude. I was grateful for the clothes that I wore, the water that I had, the food on my plate. It made me so grateful to be alive, because people go through situations like this and they survive against all odds, and it's such a wild thing to read about. It felt so impossible, but it was a real thing that happened, and I cannot recommend this memoir enough. If you're remotely interested in this, I would highly recommend it, because this was was just absolutely fantastic and also very well written. I think it was just a beautiful memoir. If you're looking for something a little bit gothic after seeing Nosferatu, I would highly recommend that you pick up Lady Macbeth by Ava Reid. This is one of my most anticipated reads of 2024, and it did not disappoint. I've always wanted a book or a movie centered around Lady Macbeth because she's a very interesting character that Shakespeare has created. The way that we don't really explore her personality or her backstory always interested me because I always knew that there was something beneath the surface. So Ava Reid took the concept of Lady Macbeth and expanded it into this beautiful gothic dark tale. Macbeth is always an interesting play to me because there is like a paranormal element to it, and I think that that is largely explored in Lady Macbeth, where she is treated like a witch and she is kind of outcasted from society and forced to marry this man, and she is thrust into a situation that she kind of twists in her favor. And one of my favorite aspects of this novel is the fact that you're a little bit distanced from Lady Macbeth. You don't necessarily know her motivations. You don't necessarily know her too well as a character, and that may annoy people. I think it added an air of mystery to the novel that made me enjoy it even more because I didn't know what she was going to do next, and she's such a cunning character. This is also beautifully written. It's so atmospheric. It's so dark and wet and just so ominous and gloomy. It felt like a rainy day in book form, and I loved Lady Macbeth. I do think that the latter half of the novel is a little bit weaker and it could have been stronger. I felt like it wrapped up too quickly, and I think the element of romance that is introduced into this novel kind of weakens Lady Macbeth's character. I'm not saying that strong women can't have relationships, but I think the way that it was shoehorned into this novel kind of weakened it a bit. I think that Lady Macbeth could have stood on her own as a character. This is a favorite book of mine for 2024, but I also do have critiques of it, which I kind of went into more depth in my reading blog, which I will link down below because I read books inspired by Shakespeare, and I went into depth about my thoughts about the novel, but I loved it. I thought it was great. I thought it was really interesting. I hope we get more Shakespearean retellings in the future. I think they're really fun. I think that people having their own take on it is really fresh and new, and I hope we eventually get an Ophelia retelling because she's another character that I'm greatly interested in, and I just love every single woman from Shakespeare's world. I think they're all so interesting and they deserve their own novels. My next nonfiction that I have to recommend is my first ever biography, and it is an 18-hour long biography, and if you have been watching this channel for a while, you know what I'm going to talk about. I'm talking about The Road to Jonestown, Jim Jones and the People's Temple by Jeff Gwynne. This past summer I went to the beach with my friends and I told them that I don't know a lot about Jim Jones. He's constantly mentioned in cultural memes like don't drink the Kool-Aid, but I didn't know anything about him. So on our ride back home, I went onto Reddit and I looked up like best nonfictions about Jim Jones, and I was overwhelmingly recommended The Road to Jonestown, and I decided to listen to it on audiobook because clearly this is a big novel, and this chronicles Jim Jones' childhood all the way up to the Jonestown Massacre onwards. And Jim Jones is a heinous person, and Jeff Gwynne deserves every award out there for putting in years of research to create such a cohesive, accessible nonfiction about a horrible man in history. And I was really blown away by this nonfiction because it showcases Jim Jones' rise to power and what it's like to have a cult leader amass such a big following, and what his strategies were like in order to gain their trust, in order to have them feel like they owed their life to him. And he's a really intelligent person in the way that he was able to manipulate over 900 people into following him against all odds, against better judgment. And this is what it's like when you follow a leader without using true judgment, and you are just the most loyal follower without thinking about the consequences or what he truly stands for, because he's a man full of contradictions and he doesn't make sense. And it's so interesting to realize that he is based off of being a fraud, and yet he got such a big following. And to leave you off with discussing this book, I wanted to read you a quote that I always read to people when I discuss this book with them, and it says, "Jim Jones had wanted his grand gesture to make an impression on the entire entire world, and to that extent, he succeeded. But the Jonestown deaths quickly became renowned not as a grandly defiant revolutionary gesture, but as the ultimate example of human gullibility. The people who joined him were sadly gullible, and they believed anything that he said, whether or not it was rooted in logic and reason. And I think this is a great nonfiction to pick up if you are one of the people like me who always wonders, why do people join cults? Why do people get that deep into a cult that ruins their life? And I think that this really answers that question, because you can see how he started manipulating people from like the age of 15. It's absolutely heinous. I truly think it's one of the most readable, exhaustive, and impressive nonfictions I have read in terms of the research, the detail, and the amount of description that is put into a singular nonfiction. Cannot recommend it enough. It's a very dark read, so definitely be warned of that if you know anything about Jim Jones and the People's Temple, but I think it's definitely worth picking up, especially in our current age. We have 2 more novels that I absolutely loved in 2024, and I'm very excited to talk about both of them. So let's talk about the next one, which is The 7-Year Slip by Ashley Poston. I have a reading blog all about this that you can watch and you can see my reactions to. This is a story about a woman named Clementine who inherits her aunt's apartment after she passes away, and the apartment is very special. It has the ability to travel backwards and forwards 7 years into the past or the future, and Clementine travels 7 years to the past, where a man is subletting the apartment and he is a chef and they form a connection with one another. But the whole entire issue that arises is the fact that they are 7 years apart from one another. So the 7-Year Slip I picked up because it was constantly spoken about on Bookstagram and Book Talk. People constantly spoke about how this is their favorite romance of the year. But I put this on the list not only because of the romance, but also because this greatly explores grief. And this explores the grief between a woman who lost her aunt, and I lost my aunt this year, and it happened to coincide that I had started this novel a couple days before my aunt passed away, and then I completely forgot that this novel, because I only read like 5 pages of it, was exploring the death of an aunt. And when I picked it up again, I was overcome with grief and just so much emotion that I had to put it down for a couple weeks, and then I decided to pick it up again because I knew if I didn't pick it up, I was never going to finish the book, because I was always going to be afraid of its explorations of grief. And I think that The 7-Year Slip is so special because it's so much more than a romance. I always say it feels more lit fic than romance, because a large part of this novel explores what it's like to lose a very important family member, and that's exactly how I felt while I was reading it. I've never felt so seen before like that in such a specific way, and I go into detail about that in my reading blog, but I felt so connected to this story beyond the romance that it has. I felt so connected to Clementine, and I really appreciated her explorations of grief because it reminded me of my own while I was going through it while I was reading this novel. And I definitely do want to read more books by Ashley Poston because she is a really fantastic writer, and I'm really grateful that she shared her story with us. Last but not least, I have my 10th favorite read of 2024, and I matched the cover of it, and it is Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers. I decided to listen to this on audiobook, and I listened to the version of the audiobook that is narrated by Andy Serkis. He is the voice of Gollum in the movies, and Andy Serkis, I did not realize, is one of the most talented voice actors I've ever had the pleasure of listening to. He is able to perfectly mimic every single actor's voice in the audiobook, and truly it was one of the most exhilarating audiobook experiences that I've ever had. I felt a rush of excitement every time I picked up this novel, and what's really fun is that I was listening to the audiobook while I was reading alongside it, so it really helped me digest the book even better than I did with the original book that I read just physically, because I'm not a big fantasy reader and I always find it a little bit difficult to get into a fantasy book, so I thought listening to the audiobook while I read along would make the experience so much better. And it did. It really elevated the experience. The Lord of the Rings is one of the most important series in my entire life, and being able to read Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers for the first time was so exciting, especially with Andy Serkis narrating the entire novel, because he made it so much more enjoyable and he really brought this story to life. He added a really rich texture to the story, and it made me enjoy it so much more, because I always find fantasy a little bit harder to get through just because it's not my preferred genre. genre, but I was blazing through this novel and I had so much fun with it. Cannot recommend his audiobook editions enough. They are absolutely fantastic, and I'm so happy I finally read The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers to compare it to the movie, and I just love Lord of the Rings so much more than I originally did because I read this book. Those are my favorite reads of 2024. I feel like I had a fantastic reading year despite the fact that my quantity went down. I feel like my quality went up and I found a lot of new favorite reads. I delved into nonfiction a little bit more. I read some gothic tales. I read The Lord of the Rings, and I found some amazing novels that have become new favorites of mine. Please let me know your top 5 favorite reads of 2024 down below, and based on the books that I loved, recommend me books that you think I should add to my 2025 TBR that are kind of in the same vein or you think would be my vibe. I'm so excited about 2025 and I really want to beef up this channel and be more active on here, post more reading vlogs, post more discussions. So if you have any video ideas that you would like to see from me in the future, please put them down below as well. If you want to follow me anywhere else on social media, I am very active and chronically online. All my links will be down below. Thank you so much for watching. If you are new here, please be sure to subscribe to see more videos from me in the future. And I'm so thankful to anyone who's made it to the end of this video. If you have, leave a book emoji down below so we can see who stays for the longest. If you do, thank you so much, and I will see you in another video very soon. Bye!